If you were to conduct a survey of British book readers, asking them to name, say, 3 science fiction books, I'm pretty sure that at least one of them would be a John Wyndham novel. And there's a good chance it would be Day of the Triffids. The word Triffid is now a regular shorthand way of describing any large, exotic-looking plant. This classic post-apocalyptic tale has had an influence on British science fiction ever since it was published in 1951. It's been adapted for film, radio, and television many times. But for me, and many other viewers of the 80s, there's only one adaptation which has really captured the story, and that's the one we're talking about today, the BBC 1981 TV series. Welcome to Very British Futures. I'm Gareth Preston, and joining me behind the safety of a Triffid-proof fence, dressed in sensible knitwear and anoraks, are Chris and Ella Burton and Rik Hoskin. Rik Hoskin is making a welcome return visit after talking last year about an even grimmer apocalypse, Freds. He's a best-selling author whose work includes the graphic novel adaptation of White Sand by Brandon Sanderson, the novel Bystander 27, and a parade of comics, novels, and video game storylining. Ella Burton is a singer, songwriter, musician, and actor who's performed in both folk and rock bands in her career. Chris Burton is an actor who has appeared on stage with several local groups over the last 40 years, as well as being one of the founder, director, producers of the fringe group Living Room Theatre, alongside Ella. In recent years, he's contributed to several films from the Manchester Indie Filmmakers Group. So, hello and welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hello, lovely to be with you.
Yeah, hello. Well, thanks for asking me back, Gareth.
My pleasure. And it's great to be talking about, I think, a show that we've all got quite fond memories of, that we've recently been reviving with a rewatch.
I think it's probably worth, even before we get any further, in saying if you were of a certain age, this was science fiction for us. This was mind-blowing stuff, wasn't it?
Very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was a teenager, it was very, very sort of popular science fiction, and I think I read all of John Wyndham when I was a teenager. Not that I remember all of it now, but I was really into him at that age.
Likewise.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was similar. I went through that phase of sort of getting all his books out of the library. I think it's something particularly for British science fiction fans, I think, at a certain age, having a bit of a Wyndham period.
I think I have the strange honour of actually studied Day of the Triffids at school.
Oh.
So that was my first experience of reading John Wyndham was in an English class.
Oh,
I had
wow.
that was teacher, clearly.
Rather more progressive, I suppose, than my own education, which stuck with the more sort of traditional, sort of classical works that everyone was looking at the time. But we didn't really do science fiction, which is, in some respects, just as well, because it meant I was able to appreciate it all for what I wanted to get out of it and what I was getting out of it, and not what I was sort of told or taught ought to be the way to look at it, if you like.
That is a very good point, Chris, because I've never forgiven my English class for Thomas Hardy or Thomas Hardy for my English class.
Yeah, I feel like that about D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah.
Because we did that for A-level.
They
did manage to ruin Jane Austen for me, though, so maybe they might not have ruined John Wyndham.
Some things you can come back to later and appreciate, I think. We're stepping all over your introduction.
That's so fun. No, it's all interesting stuff. For my mind, it was Mayor of Casterbridge and Thomas Hardy was our main book for studying, and then a bit of Jane Eyre as well.
Wow. I clearly got the best deal out of everyone.
The Day of the Triffids was broadcast in 6 episodes on BBC One between the 10th of September and the 15th of October 1981. It was a co-production between the BBC, ABC in Australia and RCTV in the USA. Produced by David Maloney, who had overseen the first 3 seasons of another BBC science fiction series, Blake 7, and was directed by Ken Handam, a TV and film director who worked extensively in both the UK and his native Australia during a long career. John Deteen, who was already well known to viewers from Jesus of Nazareth and the period drama To Serve Them All My Days, played the main protagonist, Bill Marsden. He's joined by Emma Ralph as his girlfriend, Jocelyn, and other notable actors included Maurice Colburn and John Hollis. All versions of this story begin with Bill in a hospital bed, waiting for the bandages to be removed from his eyes, following treatment for a Triffid sting. Triffids are carnivorous plants which can walk and possess whip-like stings to kill their prey. They've been cultivated in great numbers for their oil. Last night, the whole world witnessed a spectacular meteorite shower in the night sky, but this morning, virtually the whole human population has been struck blind. Removing his bandages, Bill goes in search of other sighted people as civilization collapses around him. He rescues a young woman called Jo from her blind captor, and they team up. At first, they think that they and their fellow survivors can restore society for everyone, but quickly they have to face the truth that it will take all their energies just to survive themselves. Not only are there mobs of desperate blind people, disease, and other survivors to overcome, but the Triffids have come into their own, rapidly spreading and preying on the helpless. Looking back at it, I'd be interested in your first impressions, overall opinions of the Day of the Triffids. And I'd like to start with Ella, please.
Yeah, it was nice to come back to it, actually. And I think I must have watched it the first time round, although I don't remember that much about it. But I was very struck. I mean, it's quite odd looking at it backwards, looking back in time, to the production values of the time and how well they've stood up. I really liked the way they portrayed the Triffids because they were creepy. The tapping was creepy and the mood was quite a strong chord with me as well. Even in the open sequences with this sort of grey-green faces looking lost and looking blind and the disjointed music really helped with the atmosphere. It reminded me of the book really well. I thought it was a very good adaptation of it. I mean, I've seen some more modern versions of it that I really sort of didn't go with the original book at all. Took it somewhere totally different. It was quite odd. But I really like going back to the basics with it.
I mentioned when we began this that it's such a memory for me, and it's so surprising coming back to it because it was, if I'm right, I think this was shown sort of BBC One about 7:30, 8 o'clock in the evening. This was family viewing. But when you watch it, and certainly the first episode, it feels like a documentary. It's very realistic. It doesn't have a lot of incidental music. It's presented in a very realistic or naturalistic way. And because of that, it's gripping and disturbing. It's quite horrifying in places because there's so much implied. I really, really enjoyed coming back to it and just seeing how well crafted it is. And I mean, we can talk about the series as a whole, but certainly the first episode is remarkably well made because it's all made on film. It all appears to be made on location. And it's really all, as you said in your introduction, it's all sort of from the point of view of Bill in his bed, having been recovering from an accident that's blinded him, but he does recover, obviously. And so we're kind of locked in. What can he hear as our story? He is literally the eyes on the story for us. He's the viewer's eyes on the world, and that makes it very. It's the equivalent of having a single camera telling a documentary. It's so well done, and I think throughout. I mean, Ella's just said about how terrifying the knocking of the Triffids is and how that stayed with her all these years. And I think all of us who saw that when we were, in our formative years, shall we say, I think we all remember that. And one thing about it is how very convincing the Triffids are. And that's a strange thing. So they're walking plants, which is on one hand ridiculous. On the other hand, it loans itself so well as a concept to a quite limited or budget or primitive special effects. Because if you get it right, you can make it so convincing. And I think it's a bit of rubber and a little bit of jam to make it glisten a bit or something like that. It's not clever, but it doesn't need to be. And I think throughout the whole series, there's only one thing that stands out as a special effect, which is I think Bill uses a Triffid gun at one point, and it's so obviously added afterwards. It fires some weird triangle at the viewer, and it's the only time that I think the illusion is broken. There are a few other points. It's a shame that being a 70s, 80s science fiction, it does revert to using videotape for studio. And that always does jar a little bit because of the way it's lit and so on. But generally, it stands up as a tremendous, tremendous adaptation. Very, very faithful to the book. And what it does very well is it doesn't make it flashy. It sticks with what Wyndham was very good at, which is about the human impact of these events. It's all about the emotion. It makes you ask, what moral decisions would I make if I was the last guy who could help, if I was the last person who could see? It doesn't care about where these things are from. There's ideas about conspiracy theories. There's talk about, are they genetically modified? Have they come from Russia? The story isn't about the science fiction element. It's about the human element of how do we cope? How do we survive? How does it affect people? Yeah, so
it sort of strips us back. It strips us bare down to the basics, doesn't it? The survival.
And I was going to say, with a show like this, and what characterises television of that time, which is, I think you said 1981 or 82, is it has very little incidental music, which makes it feel a lot more like it's really happening, like it's real. We don't have those dramatic cues every 15, 20 seconds to tell us how to feel. It's like, no, you watch it and you'll get it from what you're seeing. And I think that adds to that real sense of it being a genuine thing that could be happening. It's our world. It's the world outside our window.
I agree absolutely with everything that Rik was just saying. And of course, the first impression was, of course, back in 81. And at that time, as sort of someone who'd been a teenager throughout the 70s, into science fiction, sort of, I was, as we were discussing before, sort of into reading as much science fiction as I could, and including as much John Wyndham as possible. I'd loved sort of like previous shows of a similar theme. I mean, in my mind, still looking back, I always equate Day of the Triffids with Survivors, which was another series which was broadcast, I think, slightly before Day of the Triffids, although, of course, the original story for Triffids predated it. A similar sort of a feel, a sort of, again, a sort of a post-apocalyptic world. Sort of, there'd been you had a world where everything had broken and gone wrong, and again, first impressions at that age, the fact that it was a very attractive and watchable cast. It did have that strong documentary feel, as Rik sort of said, that you're involved with the people, and I guess a personal thing for me as well, having grown up on a farm in the middle of the countryside, the fact that when you lose all the technology and access to all the facilities that you're used to, and particularly sort of back then in the 70s, it's easy to sort of forget how much we didn't have then that we take for granted now. The fact that was the go-to places people getting out of the city and going to the countryside, and that was to a very familiar environment for me. Those country lanes they were driving down, they could have been outside my front door. They could have been close to the farm that I lived on, and it was so relatable. And as Rik said, because it wasn't flashy, it didn't overreach itself in that sense. And whether that was driven by budget or artistic decision didn't matter to me then, but that first impression was that this was just gripping stuff, and that's why it was lovely to come back to it and have that first impression confirmed that this was quality. This is good stuff, and it does stand up really, really well.
Gimmickry as such, you had the Triffids, but it wasn't the overplaying all the gimmickry and wild noises, all those sort of things. It was just life as it was for them, for those people.
Definitely, even though it's called Day of the Triffids, it's not a creature feature at all, really. The Triffids are in the background for most of it, and you don't feel disappointed by that. I mean, even as a child, where I was, well, teenager, when monsters meant more to me, I remember not feeling disappointed that there weren't many, that you'd often only have like a couple of appearances of a Triffid in most episodes. And it's interesting what Chris said about the Survivors connection. Now, I hadn't seen Survivors at the time. It's interesting that both Survivors and Day of the Triffids come from the same place of the author, John Wyndham and Terry Nation, respectively, both having this kind of realization about how complex our modern society is, how easy it would be to derail, and how very quickly it could fall down.
It's worth pointing out the book was published in 1951, which is just post-war. We've been through two world wars, in fact. So imagining I can't say the word, apocalyptic society was something that was in a lot of people's minds. You know, how you cope. If the war had gone differently, how would it have coped? If people had dropped a bomb on us and it wiped a lot of us out, how would we have coped? And I think those sort of things were in a lot of people's minds at that point.
And particularly for the television adaptation, of course, as I said, we've just been through the 70s where we'd had 3-day weeks, where we'd had electricity cuts and not just sort of outages for 5 minutes. I mean, we used to take a candle to bed even in the 70s because there was no electricity for a couple of days or whatever. So it was a real sort of potential risk for people. It was something that perhaps until very, very recently, with events in Ukraine, a modern audience might not sort of relate to as well because they wouldn't see it as being a potential reality. Whereas loss of infrastructure then was a very real fear, and I think that probably contributed to the fact that people could relate to it. I mean, I remember my own father going to like the civil defence meetings and things that the government used to organise for the risk of nuclear war or atomic war. So again, in terms of the ability to sort of relate to or be concerned about that loss of infrastructure, it plays into very real fears.
The fear of nuclear war was very, very powerful at the time as well, because it was the early 80s when I was working for the council. I was designated as an emergency worker in case of these sort of things happening. And I was given a pencil, a pad, and an armband, basically, and a torch, I think, something like that. But, you know, in case we had to evacuate everybody, in case we had to look after everybody, in case of those sort of things happening, it was, and you know, that book that when the wind blows, is very much in people's minds, and so I think that when this came out, it really struck a chord, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I
think it's science experimentation as well that people were starting to be worried about.
I think you're absolutely right that that it is a post-apocalyptic scenario that they suddenly find themselves in, and something that Chris alluded to with Survivors and with this. What was interesting about Day of the Triffids is it was a science fiction show in a time when science fiction was Star Wars, when science fiction was big and showy and special effects. And this is basically a horror story. It's people trying to survive a horror that's mostly off camera, as Gareth said. We hardly see the Triffids. And even, I mean, I probably was about 10 or 11 when I first saw this. I wasn't disappointed by that. I loved the Doctor Who. I loved to see the Daleks come chasing the Doctor, and that was terrifying and brilliant. But this off-screen horror, that's even worse. You know, that really is genuinely upsetting, because if he's not on the screen, he could be outside my window instead. You know, that's how I felt at the time. I'm a little bit more mature now. I don't need to check the curtains every time, but definitely it has that.
The feeling that it could really happen.
Yeah.
Something like that could really happen.
Ella, you've managed to terrify me to learn that the people who are going to look after us were just armed with an armband.
Yes,
Well,
an armband. And
I was very low
to
down the
think it
pecking order.
was-
We laughed about it because we thought, what are we supposed to do with this?
Direct others.
Well, I think that horror mood was established by the very memorable opening sequence, which was designed by Donald Bates. I think that they're very striking and memorable. It's interesting. Again, you hardly see the Triffids in it. It's just people's faces. And I wondered at the time, I thought it was done with an infrared camera because it has that kind of colouring.
Yeah, it's almost monochrome, isn't it? And it's got they are in extreme close up. It's essentially a Zoom meeting. It's what we're watching. There's hardly anything going on, and I think and it's all implication, isn't it? And the thing that really gets me about the credits is not the opening credits, it's the closing credits, which follow the same pattern. It's only, I think, one or two colours going on there. It may be graded black and white film, I'm not sure. But what it does is it has that moment where the Triffid sting actually hits the camera or hits the viewer's eyes as they're reading. And that is a wonderful trick. Like, you're still part these aren't closing credits, you're still part of this show, you're in this world, this thing's coming for you. And the whole thing, it holds its tension the whole time. There's no break, there's no relief even in the credits.
The other thing that hits home, talking about what I was saying before as well, is that in that sort of circumstances, who looks after anybody? Who is coming to the rescue? What? Because they're in the same state, you know. When we were talking in the country about possibility of nuclear war, the advice was given to us, and we were told to hide under the table.
Paint your windows white. That was always an interesting one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because at first everyone is assuming that someone is going to step in. They're talking about, it's that we've got to keep going just a bit longer until some kind of authority comes in to rescue us. And again, it's asking that question of you: how long would you sort of sit in your house?
That's quite clever, having it in the hospital to start with, because as a patient, you are expecting someone to come and look after you. He's expecting someone to come and manage his eyes. He's calling for his breakfast, and then when he when he's able to see again, and he finds the doctor who's supposed to be looking after him, who's also blind, and then presumably commits suicide. Who's looking after the people that look after you?
And
it sets the scene very soon that's what's happening everywhere.
He's left with that dilemma very early on about who do I help other than myself, isn't he? And he helps Joe very early on, being the other sighted person. It's like, well, they've got the most valuable resource left. They've got eyes that work, and so few have. But the way in which they're treated by certain groups they bump into is quite horrific, and it's like your whole world has been turned upside down. You're a prisoner because you have an ability, and that's a very interesting dilemma they're put in. And the dilemma is rephrased throughout the series, where it becomes the question of, is religion the answer, which is hinted at, and is the army the answer, which is very ruthless, which is very similar to another thing that Gareth and I discussed a year or so back, Threads, where it was the question of what does the army do, what is its real ability once the tragedy has happened, how does it organise? What you have to make decisions among people, and you have to make very hard and often merciless decisions.
In fact, the scary thing is that it might well mobilise and make those decisions for you in the way that it does in the book.
Yeah, the whole question of who's in charge is dealt with in a very interesting way, I think, as Rik was sort of suggesting, and the fact that your first thought is, well, in the Kingdom of the Blind, the one-eyed man is king. But it's interesting that at the first, you'd think that the sighted would very much be the ones in charge, and yet we have situations where the blind are at one stage that they're grabbing sighted people and trying to make them work for them. The chap with the stick, they grab the girl, or when someone turns up in a car and they know there's someone sighted, the blind are trying to grab them. And actually, the sight is potentially something that will entrap people rather than enable them. And so it works through these different scenarios, and sort of until different statuses do start to assert themselves. So it doesn't just take an easy route of saying this is the way it would be. I think, like the best of science fiction, it raises ideas and questions and posits ideas, and this idea of status and who actually is in charge. It's not just groups. It's the very sort of nature of what's disabling people in the first place. The area that it doesn't seem to cover particularly is, what about the people who were blind before? Because obviously, there are blind people in society, and I don't really get a sense of the question of, would they gain an extra sort of position by virtue of the fact that they're used to this situation that they find themselves in, so they're not having to cope with being newly blind. Obviously, they wouldn't be affected by the disease in the same way, because that's not the source of their blindness.
It's interesting you say that. I think it's episode 2, because there is a moment when we see, the people are groping around, and then in the background there's a blind man with a white cane who comes just kind of walking past, tapping, and we see that through Bill's eyes, and he sort of says, "Oh, and he has that realization that you've just talked about, Chris."
There's an irony as well that he's tapping his cane, and it's very similar to the noise the Triffids make. It's like, this guy's probably going to be seen as the enemy by people who can't see, and I is that better? I'm sure, because he's making the same noise.
It's true, actually. I thought that. Yeah.
One of the things that the notes I made watching it again is that how much there's a zombie film kind of aesthetic going on here. Now, to some extent, it sort of predates the main kind. We had George A. Romero's films and stuff, but zombies weren't going mainstream in the way that they would be in the 21st century. But it has a lot of that language of a zombie film. But it has this difference in that the blind people aren't conveniently dead. So you don't want to go hacking and shooting. Most people don't want to go hacking and shooting their way through a lot of people who are actual still living people, especially that scene in the car where they're surrounded.
Where the mob.
But there is that group that they come across that kills. We talk about the blind, the sighted being a prisoner of the blind, and that's what in effect Croker does, makes those groups happen. But then Bill's group gets waylaid by a gang with guns, and they do actually shoot some of the blind people, don't they?
And that's an interesting little point, which I picked up on. I don't think it's made very evident when you watch the show, but the guy who shoots at him is actually the army leader.
The Gary Olsen character.
Yeah, he's actually meant to be the same character. Yes, but he winds up in I think they're the Brighton army, aren't they? They call them something like they've got a base in Brighton. So he's made his way out there and worked his way to the top, and they are the people who use force to get their way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which was inevitable. I mean, the guy when Bill first finds the child that was sighted originally and takes him into their house, and the blind couple are telling Bill what's happened. And the blind man says he's keeping the truth from his wife. Yeah. But the blind man says when they get hungry, they're going to start killing each other. He gives a few comments on the foretells what's going to happen. Yeah. That's in the first episode, which sets the whole scene for the rest of it. So you're armed with this information from the word go, in the way it's put over as like a documentary in a sense.
There's so much in there that we're told just through conversation. We don't need to really see It's very well handled. It's like we've got the idea of what's going on in the whole of society, or at least in the whole of Britain. It's hard to see what's going on further, but just from a few conversations among a few people, it's very, very cleverly done that way.
And the bits that aren't filled in by Bill's narrative, because he has a narrative as well. Because when he's in those groups, he's telling Jo, he writes a letter to Jo, even though he doesn't know where she is, about what's been going on and how heartbreaking it is.
Yes.
So that fills us in those little gaps in the passage of time.
It is. There's some very nice bits of TV writing from Douglas Livingstone in adapting it, and making choices like that, using like the letter writing or the initial when he's recording notes on a dictaphone for a book that will never be published. But it's a nice little device just to kind of quickly bring us up to speed on Triffids. And it's interesting you mentioned that, but Gary L. Torrance is the character he comes back as. And that's the sort of thing I certainly didn't notice when I watched it back in the 80s. In a way, I think it's only when you watch it quite close together, I think, that you really pick up that subtle point. And it's a lovely subtle point that, he's a nasty guy, and it sort of, and then the army in episode 6 are basically just a bigger gang, really. They're just he's got this slight veneer of being an officer, but we know that really he's basically an armed thug, really.
It's I think if anything, it's a little bit too subtle in the TV show. I mean, I watched the full series again in a day so that we could discuss it, and it's hard to pick up. It's if you're reading the credits, you think, is he meant to be the same character? And I sort of went back to the book, and indeed he is. So, but I don't. I think they could have made it more explicit in the show because it is an interesting plot point. But
this brings up the sort of morality issues as well, because people are trying to survive, and we talk of them as thugs and everything. And in the book, it does say that that they're not really succeeding in the years to come, but their idea is they're trying to rebuild society, aren't they? And to protect the society as we've known it in their own way. And that's all they know is that sort of enforcement. And they're trying to keep blind people alive. So how wrong is that? By putting 30 people with them. And if you try and turn it around and examine their motives, but it is cold and callous. And sometimes humans are.
Of course, Bill and Jo have sorted out their own environment that is safe and that works for them. So having somebody come in and invade it because you've got something we want, we're on his side. We're like, no, we've been with Bill this whole time. He's got to be right.
A lot of societies do this to people all the time, don't they? Even our society does that to a certain extent. You're not allowed to do this. You can't do that because our society's got to survive. And you do get people fighting against that. And really, as the way it's written, and from Bill's point of view, we're with Bill. We want a nice society where people care about each other, and it's not just numbers and statistics and this is what you're going to do because we're in charge. If you sit back from that and you sort of look at their morality, which we think is immoral because of the way they're doing it, but they're just trying in their own way to make society work as well.
No, I was going to say they are just trying to survive, but I think that's again one of the things that the story handles in, I suppose, a fairly subtle way. But it does acknowledge that there isn't necessarily one right way of doing it, but there are better ways. So, like when Coker towards the end is sort of outlining, look, come to the Isle of Wight if you don't like the way that we do things. There's another group on the Channel Islands, and he's not saying it as, it's got to be our way. It's saying, okay, there are different ways. We're trying it this way. If this doesn't suit, go with them and try it that way. It doesn't have to be, this is our way. If you don't agree with us, we will by force make you agree. We will take what you have got. It's sort of, again, it is raising the fact that, and it seems to take the line that the successful way of doing things is to acknowledge that there isn't just one best way, and that when everything's gone and you're building from scratch, you will need to experiment, but it doesn't have to be sort of strict, thuggish, authoritarian. It needs rules, it needs agreement, but it doesn't have to be that unpleasant.
question of, I suppose, and we all come in thinking, well, cooperation is going to create the best result, and that's kind of the argument that's put forth, isn't it? That if you cooperate and everybody's voice is heard, this is democracy, and democracy will, in this situation, will make us thrive, as opposed to, as Chris has said, the authoritarian state. Whether that's right or not in that situation, I don't really. We need to know, the 10 years on of the Triffids to really find out what happened there.
Yeah, so that is just like, I remember as a kid being slightly, oh, what a place to end it, even though it ends in the same place as the book.
And annoyingly, it does jump ahead 6 years, doesn't it? And you think, come on, then, if you can do that once, do it again. Give us more.
Possibly. But no, it's a fair point to pick me up. I mean, fug is a very pejorative word, but it's a fair point what you say, Chris, that there's different approaches. I mean, in that episode 6, when Bill says, you're saying you want to set me up as some kind of feudal lord, and that is an approach. I mean, yeah, the problem is that they're enforcing it at the point of a gun, to the point that they're going to take away his adopted daughter, basically.
Yeah, and without any regard to humanity or anybody's feelings, that doesn't enter their plans at all, does it?
Largely, although other people say that about the Isle of Wight, because of the whole purpose of young women is to have babies, which of course some people object to. Interestingly, in the book, it's a male doctor who does that speech about about the women, their priority is having babies, and men can take on several fertile blind women if necessary for this. Whereas in the TV series, they make it a woman to make it slightly more palatable for the audience.
They don't tell us that much about the Isle of Wight settlement and whether it is that sort of attitude still. It sounded much more like a communal, setup. And that Bill's expertise would be welcome because of his degree in biology and everything. As he finishes the book, he mentions Torrance in the end of the book, doesn't he? It seems unlikely anything will come of Torrance's neo-feudal plan, but they hear they're a life of squalid wretchedness, but there are not so many of them. It sounds like those sort of stockades are dying out. So he says we must regard the task ahead as ours alone, and they're going to go back and wipe the Triffids out eventually. It's still a work in progress, isn't it? It's the future. That's the future hope.
Turning away a little bit from I'm loving the philosophy, looking a little bit on the nuts and bolts of the series. I'd like to talk a little bit about the design of the Triffids, which is, I think, as both Chris and Rik have intimated, is rather ingenious. Apparently, they did do some research at the Natural History Museum, came up with the idea that since Triffids are ostensibly parasitic, sit on top of rotting bodies for their nutriment, that they would be naturally brown in colour, like mushrooms and other sort of fungal.
I said to Chris that they reminded me, like the Venus flytraps, all these other ones with the sort of like the sort of bowl with a liquid inside. These other plants that exist like the Triffids reminded me very much of.
There is a touch of the pitcher plant, yes, about that, about their neck.
That is one of the strengths, is the design. I think it is a very believable plant. It does look like exotic plants we've seen. It's got a real fibrous feel to it, and I think, again, I think it's almost a benefit that they didn't have modern CGI, because I think the tendency would be now to make them far more fluid. If we've got the CGI, we can make them move and do all these different things. And the strength of them is that they don't. They are plants. They have that sort of basic rigidity, and yet they have the mobility. They have the drumming. They have that wonderful sort of fly trap and the neck and the stinger and everything. But they look like plants, and they don't sort of overreach themselves in any sort of way. They stay within the boundaries of what you would expect them to do.
They were designed by somebody called Steve Druitt, who worked in the Natural History Museum, I believe.
Ah,
You can actually Google exactly what they were consisted of, which is really quite interesting.
you like to share a bit?
Well, it was operated by a man crouched inside, cooled by a fan installed in its neck, apparently. The clockers were radio controlled. The gnarled bowl, based on the ginseng root, was made of latex with a covering of sawdust and string, and the neck was fiberglass, and that continued down to the floor where it joined with the operator's seat. And then there was a flexible rubber head coated with clear gunge. What impressed me when Bill actually cut into it is you could see the fibrousness of the plant, and that looked very real. You know, like when you cut a leaf, it was that sort of fibrousness that you could see. And I thought that was so well done.
I agree. Yes, I think that's a very effective moment when he stabs at it, and it's interesting. It's a kind of sort of PG kind of gory moment. It's not gory really because it's a plant, you know, but it has that kind of imagery. But
and of course, the creepiness of the communication as well.
All we know that they're really saying is they're knocking to each other, saying, "There's something here we can eat if we kill it," and that's. Wow, that's like the most wonderful survival instinct around, isn't it? There's that flashback very early on in episode 1, which Bill has, which gives us the whole backstory. And his scientific, or whatever he is, partner there, says life's got too complex and these Triffids, they're simple. They understand just how to survive. And we realise that more and more as the story goes on, that they're not building anything. They're not going to create anything. They're just going to eat and feed and multiply. That's all they're there for.
Life at its simplest.
Yeah, I do quite like the ambiguity, although they pretty much probably are just ants, that we never really get to the bottom of just how aware and sentient they are with that, whether that clacking is some kind of real language. Or just a kind of echo location.
We just get hints and we get people's theories. There's a degree of conspiracy theory that runs through all of Day of the Triffids, where people, you know, I think they came from the USSR. They came from the other side of the Iron Curtain. I think they're genetically modified, but you know, maybe they're not. Maybe they're not of Earth. And then later on was the whole problem in the sky. What was that? Was that a satellite going wrong? Was it somebody doing some kind of war test in space? And it's all just theories. We never know anything, and that's why it's such an effective story, because it leaves it so open to interpretation. It doesn't ever nail anything down, because it's as I've said before, as we've all said, it's not really about that. It's about how people react to that, what the human response is. It's emotional. So in some ways is secondary to the emotions.
So just on the design itself again, I think as well, one of the things that the design does lend itself to very effectively is those sort of shots when they are traveling and there's just a Triffid there in a field or there are Triffids dotted around the countryside, and that have that presence that they're not doing anything, but they're there. Are they listening? Are they? They're sensing something, and just the way that they're just there, and the design works for that. And I don't know whether a part of that is actually the color palette, because again, this certainly isn't something I would have considered at the time, and very often it's the sort of thing you don't think about while you're actually watching. But so much of the Day of the Triffids is actually quite a dull or a muted color palette. There's rain sequences, there's nighttime sequences, and yet the most sort of, you know, the deadly things at the heart of it, they have these wonderful flashes of color there, and it sort of, again, it contributes for me to a sense of otherness about them. They don't fit, they don't really belong, and yet they're perfectly at home there. And it's just that visually striking thing about them. As I say, I don't know whether that was intentional or, and like with the color palettes throughout, even the sort of the daytime scenes in the built-up areas, they're very grey streets. You know, we're not talking sort of spectacular, colourful and then you have these very colourful plants in the middle of it.
Sentience or not. You remember episode 5 when Bill and Croker are driving the vehicles through the countryside and they come across this pub where somebody's waving his white sheet, and the man comes out of the pub to try and find them, and the Triffid gets him as he comes out of the pub. And the comments there are, that he was waiting for him as if he knew he would be coming out of the door. And Croker says they seem to know where we are and move towards us.
Yeah.
And we do see quite a few bits where they seem to be, especially early on, where they're lying in wait for somebody. They've killed someone and they're lying nearby. Or there's another one early on where there's a man trying to get vegetables in, and the Triffid gets him there. He's on a rope being led by his wife, and the Triffid seems to have been waiting for him outside. So those are all sort of like, nothing's totally explicit. And then they watch somebody past and then they start making a noise as if they are telling somebody else, another Triffid, that something's coming. So you never get to the bottom of it, but those are the hints that they know a little bit more. They may not be very bright, they know enough to live and survive, but some sort of communication, which is quite creepy.
They seem to kind of function a little bit like insects, don't they? If you put down sugar or if you spill a drink, and some insects seem to have a discussion and go, let's all go and get it. And that's a bit of that too. It's like, there's a person in there. We'll just wait because they'll come out. And that's a very interesting thing, isn't it? It's an interesting, sort of disturbing way of looking at the world, I suppose.
And insects do communicate that way, don't they? Bees do. They have ways of communicating to other bees where the honey is and things like that, where the nectar is.
Yeah.
And given that we're talking about plants, what we now know, I say we, what scientists now know about the way that fungal growths and trees connect through the earth, the plants do communicate with each other. We don't know yet the full sort of details of that, but there is, if you like, a collective sense, a collective understanding amongst. I love that little scene near the start where the newsreel and they're taking the mickey out of the plants that have been found walking in South America, I think it is. And we look at it now, how ridiculous. And then, plants talking, how ridiculous. But now we know they do, at one level, actually communicate in our real world. So in terms of being ahead of the game, it actually, again, is sort of quite remarkable.
So
slightly worrying.
That information, with the fact that as we're recording this, we've been seeing the Northern Lights getting more and more visible in the skies to the south of England. Do you think it's all about to happen? We can all look at the Northern Lights. That's it. We'll be blind tomorrow.
We're going to feel so foolish because we can't say we haven't been warned.
No. Just upload the podcast quick. Warn the world.
Just today, I read something on the net about.
So it must be true.
If there's a nuclear bomb somewhere, close your eyes because the light could blind you.
Yeah, there also. You mentioned that the couple going out to try and get cabbages or whatever on the road. That's a scene that's particularly stayed with me. I think to use the phrase lives rent free in my mind, and that will. Do you just feel for them because it's bad enough that they're blind and groping around in the garden and they're just kind of making some progress. And then they get killed by a Triffid.
I think there's two tragedies there because it's all shot at night and it's very convincing and it's very eerie. But there's also the secondary tragedy that we can see that they are blind, they're groping about, they figured out a way to do things, which is to use a rope, but they've got a very limited length of space they can use, and they've got a very limited food supply. Their whole life is based on what can we find in our garden. Once that runs out, we'll die anyway. And so I think that's a double tragedy. You're looking at how awful their life is, and then they just they're attacked. And if they weren't, we could have stuck with them for another 6 weeks before they start dying because they haven't got any food left. And so I think that's why it hammers home so well.
I think that's a scene stayed with me. I was going to ask, are there particular scenes in this series or this rewatch that particularly stand out for you, either because they're frightening or because of the acting?
Well, I was actually going to completely upend the question.
Oh, right.
And say the first episode definitely stuck with me, and it's stuck with other people as well, because I think if you ever watch 28 Days Later, the first 20 minutes of that film, it's the same film, isn't it? It's
very similar.
So close to it. It's clearly took its atmosphere from there. But yeah, I mean, so really, I'm going to say that stuck with me because I saw it in another film many years later and thought, this is all very familiar. Overall, I would say the bleak impression the whole thing gives stuck with me more than anything of an individual scene. It's because it is so complete in itself. It's one very, very well made, complete story, rather than there are no great flashy moments. It's science fiction where nobody blows up the Death Star at the end. It just keeps going relentlessly, so it doesn't. So sorry, I've completely failed to answer the question.
Well, no, that's an interesting. How about yourself, Chris?
I'm inclined to agree that it is about the whole piece. I mean, there are individual scenes that are perhaps more unsettling than others, or like you say, the opening, it does stick with you. But it's not a, and again, I like this about it. It's not something that just relies on a couple of set piece moments, so like wham bam, that's the money shot, that's the sort of the exciting bit. It's about so much more than that. So it doesn't need the sudden shock. I mean, the moments where people do get suddenly hit by a Triffid, okay, there's an element of shock, but it's not like, particularly some of the more recent horror films where, it's not that sort of a shock. And so they're not that sort of standout scenes. I think it's just, as Rik was saying, it's the whole thing. And the fact that it does drive through. And just sort of on that, one of the things that sort of sticks with me on that is the fact that for 6 really quite short episodes, it does get through an awful lot, even though it doesn't feel, while you're watching, particularly fast-paced. Nothing feels rushed or flashy, and yet they cover an awful lot of ground. And you were saying before about the quality of the writing. I think that goes a long way towards that. It's because the writing is spare without being sort of lacking. It's all there. Yes, some bits might be a bit too subtle perhaps, but it's there. It covers a lot of ground, and it doesn't do it with just sort of flashy showpiece moments. It's the whole piece throughout. And the performances, I think, are uniformly really strong. I was surprised. I'd forgotten how the names that were in there. People like Stephen Yardley is sort of there and gone, and he carried whole series by him, in his time. Gary Olsen, again, those two, really just those two moments in a way, and he was a very strong character. Obviously, John Dateen's done other stuff, and so they were a really strong cast. They all seem. I can't think of anyone that really struck a wrong note. With it.
I was never particularly convinced by Jo, I must admit. She felt a touch too theatrical in given that she was like a party girl.
I know what you mean, but when you look back again at a lot of stuff from that time, one of the advantages of like modern telly is that there's a lot of old stuff again being rerun on some channels. I think from a modern perspective, I think that's probably true, but if you compare her and a lot of other actresses, then it suddenly actually feels right for the type and the time.
Well, I was going to move on to the performances, but before I do, I'd like to ask Ella, were there any particular, going back to the earlier question, particular standout?
There was some of the sadness bits, like with the man and the woman getting the cabbages in. And if you think ahead to what their life is going to be like, or what little there is left of it, the human suffering, the girl in the hotel who tried to bribe Bill to stay with them by offering herself to him, and then she was saying things like, "It's better to be blind and alive, isn't it?" And the next thing, she had the pestilence and she wanted to die. You know, so it's a lot of sadness there. But a scene which is a bit out of time in a way, which I quite liked as well, is in the last episode where Bill and Joe escape to the seaside just for a bit. And you have a flash of what normality is or was. And they have that flash of what normality was. And they're talking about, you know, what are we going to tell the children? What are we going to tell the children? The world was so wicked it had to be destroyed, or did it destroy itself? And Bill says, we tell them the truth. And there's quite a bit of a philosophical discussion about how it all happened there. But it's that bit of moments out of time that sort of highlights how awful everything else is and how hard everything else is. That's the way it was. But they're still in the middle of everything.
It's an observation as well, Ella, because when they go to the seaside, it's almost like they've got a postcard from somebody else's holiday.
Yeah.
And it's wish you were here moment. They're like, wish we were back in the world when it was better. And it is done almost. It's almost like they've just got the postcard. They can't live in that world. And I think that is a very good point, and it does stay with you. It's very cleverly done. I will say point that did stay with me, which is completely irrelevant to this discussion, but I'll just throw it in, which is very early on when we get that flashback. I've forgotten about this, the flashback to Bill at his work, and his colleague proceeds to light up a cigarette and offer him a nightcap before he drives home. And I thought, it's so weird to see somebody smoking or lighting a cigarette on television. We haven't seen that in 30 years. You know?
No, I know. There's lots of that.
Yeah, it's such a different world.
They probably didn't even have seatbelts on.
No, didn't need them. Drive better, but he's drunk. But I was reading an interview with a comic writer called Pat Mills, and he said that they used to write for girls' comics in the 70s and then moved on to edit 2000 AD. And he was saying there's a difference between boys' fiction and girls' fiction. That girls' fiction is about friendships and about wanting to be part of a group, whereas boys' fiction is about the loner, it's about the guy who moves on. And this very much fits into that idea, because Bill, he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have a family, he doesn't have anyone he relies on. He never at any point says, I must go home and do anything. He's got no past at all, apart from the fact he worked with Triffids, so he knows something about them. He's just the adventure hero who can keep going. He has no ties. And I find that very interesting, that although it's a very emotional story, he's never dragged into the emotions.
It's true. There's a line that's always, it's not meant to be funny, but it makes you smile when they're together and they're in the show flat earlier on, taking a break, and he has this line where he says, I'll make a list. I like making lists. Which part of me part of me thinks, you know, is there a part of Jocelyn thinking, oh no, she's one. And it's interesting. She's, and now this is a little bit of Douglas Livingstone, I think, making the right call here in his adaptation. In the book, Jocelyn is an author. She's a writer who's just written a notorious book called Sex is My Adventure. And there's a running joke that wherever they go in the country, people remember this about it. But I think that I think would have interfered, I think, with the general tone of it.
Because in the farm, isn't there's 3 blind people there, isn't there? There's a couple and there's somebody called Joyce, who wasn't really she doesn't figure in the TV series. Because when Torrance comes, he's saying about you're going to have 18 more blind people to make it up to 20, so you've got double. Whereas in the book, it's 17 more because you've already got 3 blind people. And I didn't pick that up for a bit. Just a few little bit. But I mean, for a narrative on TV, you've got to make some alterations. So I understand why they did it, but it's just interesting.
Or was that like the zombie style attack on the car? Was it we can't afford to pay these actors to speak because we know speaking before. So you've just got the 2 people who speak in this house now. There were 3 in the book. We can't afford all of them.
Extras don't think had a strong equity in those days, though. So,
but I believe yes. I was going to say there's another word. It's not extras anymore, but I can't
No,
think.
it's supporting artists.
Supported artists now. So they are
Artists.
artists.
Yeah,
And they do.
no, it's all right. We've done that as well, so we know. But use colours.
Moving
But
wallpaper
yeah,
as the telly.
and they have more rights now. But you're quite right, because if you do say words or if you have direction, you do get paid more.
Yeah. Going back in our discussion really about the effects of this, and we've spoken a lot about the special effects of the Triffids, but of course we've also got the light show in the sky, and I think it's done remarkably well for the time, because I was trying to work out how they did it. It's all made on film. The doctor is in Bill's room in flashback, and he and the nurse are looking out the window. And we would expect that to be green screen. We'd expect that to be put on afterwards, but it's not. It appears to be a projection running behind glass as if it's outside the. So actually there, and it doesn't distract us. It doesn't jar in the way a lot of those effects. And I'm looking at shows like Doctor Who and Blake Seven this time. You'd get that effect on screen. You think, well, that's obviously been added afterwards. That's not there. And although it's not a great effect, the light show in the sky, because it's done in a convincing way that doesn't take it, that's on set, that's real, it. In my head as a child, I presumed the lights that came from the sky were the seeds of the Triffids, and I was very surprised to find they weren't when I rewatched it.
I thought that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd completely forgotten that. You're right. I
that.
remember thinking that now that you say it. Yeah. Yeah,
it's funny. Yeah, I remember someone at school saying, oh yeah, it was the Triffids who caused the everyone to go blind, and of course this is not true at all. It's
No, I'd always believed that for years after seeing that, and I'd be surprised myself.
Yeah,
I mean, we never find out about the pestilence either.
No, we don't. We just get that kind of guess from Bill. Going back to the beach scene again, that somehow it was so virulent and worked so fast that maybe it was assisted or was some sort of weapon.
Doesn't seem to have affected the sighted people, though. Funnily, it's weird.
No, that's true. Actually, that is actually quite interesting, though, because you'd think surrounded by ill people, it's less than sanitary conditions, that he would catch it as well. But yeah, it's interesting that the sighted people don't.
And I think that's part of what sort of plays so strongly into the, if you like, the conspiracy theory aspect of it. The fact that it does only affect those who were affected by the initial the light show. It always strikes me as being sort of like a really horrible double whammy. That you think you've just got over the blindness aspect, or why that's happened. Now, how do we cope with that? And then suddenly, but we're going to die anyway.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's a bit like sort of radiation sickness in a way after the bomb.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know whether he had that in mind, but it is. It's sort of the unforeseen consequence that follows on behind that.
But I think I'd like to get some final thoughts from people. There's no surprise that we're all fans of this particular show, but I think I'd like to start with Chris this time.
Oh, sum up the show. I suppose, final thoughts, much like my sort of initial thoughts, so that what we have in Day of the Triffids is a terrific piece of writing to start it off. That's really well adapted. I mean, we've touched on the fact that it's a very faithful adaptation of the book. And for anyone with any sort of interest in science fiction as a source of ideas and not just of sort of cowboys in space, and that's fine in its place. But as someone who wants to sort of read something that's got some thought behind it and thought-provoking, or to watch. In the case of the TV adaptation, that this is the right one to watch. Good telly all round.
I shall turn to Ella next.
Yeah, I think on the whole, I really enjoyed it, but because I suppose in some ways my background is in sort of like sociology, social anthropology, social psychology, all those sort of things, and government and governmental systems. I studied at university, and the way people react in certain circumstances. I think it was a really good narrative to examine that sort of behaviour, stripping back, the social norms that we've all grown up with, when we lose all the vestiges of, civilization. What are we really underneath? How do we survive? How do we communicate with each other? How do we live? How do we survive? And the personalities that come through on basic humanity levels. And I thought it was a really good narrative all the way through of those sorts of things. And for me, that really appeals, that sort of study. I really liked it for that side of it as well. And it was creepy.
It was indeed. And Rik, I'm going to give the final thoughts to you.
I think that Chris and Ella have both said everything that needs to be said about this, which makes it sound like I've got to go early, doesn't it? No, I think certainly Ella's picked up particularly here on sociological side of things, and certainly that soft science fiction, sort of the social sciences science fiction has always appealed to me. And in this case, I mean, I'm just looking at my notes here. It's really the whole thing, for me, hits its crescendo with episode 5, where we get that real question of morality, which is the world has ended as we know it. Now we're at the point of seeing if we can still survive. And the question is raised, does compassion have a place in this post-civilized world? And you have to answer for yourself. And as the viewer, you're very drawn in to say, well, where do I stand? Do I survive? Do I protect my loved ones? Or do you have to make very hard choices? Because you can't cling to the society that we had. You have to get out of that and transition into something new. And how do you do it? I say it's just the question of, does compassion have a place in a post-apocalyptic world? And obviously, it's a dilemma that I wrestle with in my writing world. So it's one that affects me very much. But Gareth, I'm going to turn the question on you. What would you say about it, and how would you recommend it?
I definitely recommend it for all the reasons already given. It is a very intelligent adaptation of the book. They just make the right choices all the way down the line. Everyone plays it very authentically. It's interesting what you were just saying there about it's about making choices. There's an interesting scene in episode 5 where Croker, he's the one who makes the change. This is the man who's had this big plan about how he's going to organize, how he's going to save as many people as possible, and then he says, this is no place for lone wolves. And, I'm accepting I need to go and work with other people and compromise if we're all going to survive. If the human race, if that doesn't sound too grandiose, is going to survive. I think that's the power of both the book, of the story, whether it's the book or the TV series. It's because it's so much on the ground. Yeah. It's so much told through the story of Bill that it's constantly asking us questions. We're asking, what would we do in this situations? I mean, we may not be facing killer plants in our actual lives, but we're all facing moral choices and questions about how far we go.
And I think that you have made a point there, which also Chris made earlier, really, that is, this isn't this is a very faithful adaptation. It's not an adaptation of jump scares. It's not an adaptation of being flashy. It's almost gentle the way it does it, and that's why it's so sinister, and that's why it's so effective, because it never goes too far. It holds back every time, and it makes it very, very scary. All the imagery is just enough to tell us this is the end of the world. This is how it is. And the end of the world isn't flashy. It's kind of just disastrous.
Thank you very much. The Day of the Triffids was released on DVD in 2007 and Blu-ray in 2020. It's been repeated several times on BBC One and BBC Four, whilst an international version, edited into 3 50-minute episodes, has been sold around the world. Now, before we wrap up, you are all very active and creative people. In fact, it's been a little bit of time getting our schedules right so that we could be together for this. So I would love to know, I'll start with Ella, or maybe Ella and Chris want to answer this one together, about your what are you working on at the moment?
Oh, we don't work together.
Oh.
No, actually, not quite true. We are working together on one project, but I've got
said with some enthusiasm, that wasn't it?
Oh, we work together on some things, but we have our own sort of individual things that we sort of work on as well. I mean, I'm working on some new songs at the moment, and I'm going to be performing at the Chiltern Arts Festival in May, and with my other band as well. We're performing, but we were involved in a project with the film group as well, which we are working on together, and that's about. It's going to be a Doctor Who themed project because it's the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who this year. So Chris can tell you more.
Well, I don't really want to tell you too much about that because it's sort of, spoilers. But yeah, it's sort of basically we'll be working on a project with the Manchester Indie Filmmakers Group centred around a lost episode. And sort of reimagining that, I suppose, is the best way of putting it. So we've got that. We're just about to start work on that. Just started rehearsals for my next cabaret with a group called Stage Squad in Stockport. That'll be on in July. Before that, in May, I'll be at Altrincham. We've just started rehearsing for a revival of Ray Cooney's It Runs in the Family, the sequel to Run for Your Wife. So that's a very energetic farce that, again, funnily enough, from not dissimilar, only slightly before Day of the Triffids in terms of its origin. And in some respects, it feels like it, but it is really funny, and I hope it will be when we perform it in May. So those sort of three projects will keep me busy through till July. And at some point, I've got to provide a voiceover for a dance show that's on at the same time as our cabaret. Little bits and pieces.
Wow, that sounds. I'm looking forward to all of that great stuff. And Rik, who after this seems to be always busy, but I mean, in the case of you, what can you talk about at the moment?
The first thing I do just want to say is because podcasts live on beyond us, the year we're talking about is 2023, I hope. So when we talk about, when Chris says and Ella says about doing stuff in May and July and so on, that's 2023. You might have missed it by now.
Good very point. Thank you very much.
You are correct, Gareth. I am busy, but I'm often non-disclosure agreement on a lot of things. At this point in time, as we record this, just coming up to April of 2023, I've got the third graphic novel in the Red Rising series is coming out or is out, depending on what side of the next 10 days you're on. And that's with Pierce Brown and with Dynamite Publishing. I'm doing another very big series with them, which I think will run for about 2 years. But I can't really say a lot about it. It's a fantasy series. I've been doing some video game work, and invariably I'm doing post-apocalyptic material. I'm kind of responsible for the Deathlands these days. So I am the post-apocalypse, which nobody really wanted, but somehow I've got. I may have a book I'm intending to write, and a video game that somebody wants me to do or something, but I don't know. Well, who knows what tomorrow's email will bring? There's anything down. Just say I'm busy.
I'll get something out of that. and I can certainly recommend the Red Rising series. That's been a brilliant set of comics.
Thank you. The new one's got a new artist, and he is phenomenal. We've really pushed the boat out.
Right, well, it only remains for me to thank my marvellous guests for all their insights and thoughts into the Day of the Triffids, and to thank you at home for listening. But for now, it's goodbye from
Ella Burton,
Chris Burton,
Rik Hoskin,
and I'm Gareth Preston. Very British Futures is produced and hosted by Gareth Preston. Music by Chattery Art. There's more information about the Day of the Triffids and links to related articles at our website, which you'll find at westlakefilms.uk/Very British Futures. You can now find us on YouTube. I've been busy uploading the back catalogue to my channel, so just search for Very British Futures. If you'd like to support the podcast, please share us, tell like-minded friends, or give us a good rating and review on the platform you're currently listening to. It all helps us reach more listeners. Get in touch via email, verybritishfuturespodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @FuturesVery. Join us on Discord by searching for Very British Futures. Goodbye for now.